Okay, so last time we were talking about this whole meaning thing, right? And like how it's this kind of fundamental drive against all the chaos out there and how civilization, and it's basically like our big group project to try and make some sense of it all, build some order from all that meaning stuff.
Yeah, and I think that kind of takes us to a pretty central question for today, doesn't it? When we actually look at how civilizations, actually play out, does it, like a smooth upward trajectory, or is it more like this wrestling match, full of like challenges, setbacks, that kind of stuff?
Totally. Yeah, I mean, that's the big question, isn't it? So that's what we're diving into today. We're going to be looking at how that tendency towards disorder, that entropy thing plays out in how civilization develops, like specifically how cultural conflict war and all the crazy changes within civilization itself all fit into this whole entropy picture.
And it's important to remember, right, what we talked about before, like civilization is basically this huge low entropy system. It's this structure of order that we as humans have been building in the social world. But it's not like we just build it and then boom, we're done right. We got to constantly put in the effort to work against the universe's like natural tendency to get more and more chaotic, to increase entropy.
Okay, let's rewind just a tiny bit for anyone tuning in for the first time. You know, the core idea we're playing with here is entropy. Can you give us like the super condensed version?
Sure. So basically, entropy is the universe's way of kind of leaning towards disorder, right? It's like a measure of randomness, and that second law of thermodynamics, it basically says that in any closed system, that randomness is going to increase over time.
Right. It's like things just naturally fall apart, get less organized all on their own. And civilization is basically us being like, nope, not today, chaos, and trying to build these little pockets of order against that tide. We also spent some time on meaning last time. What's the main takeaway there that we're going to be building on today?
Well, when we talk about meaning, it's like super tied to this instinct that life has to fight against chaos, like at a biological level.
Yeah.
And then civilization becomes like this big group version of that same drive, right? It's how we as societies come up with shared understandings, rules, structures, all that stuff to deal with the uncertainties of life and like make things feel a bit more predictable.
So that individual push for meaning against like your own personal chaos gets kind of scaled up into these social structures that are all about reducing chaos for everyone, right? But even these super stable civilizations, like they're not invincible, right? There's always pressure coming from both inside and outside.
Exactly. And that brings us to the heart of what we're exploring today. How does this whole entropy increase thing actually show up in civilization? Like, where do cultural clashes and wars fit into this, given that civilization is all about order, but history is full of these super intense periods of disorder, both within societies and between them?
Right. Civilization isn't like this one big blob. It's made up of tons of different cultures. And even within one civilization, you've got all these different groups, subcultures. It's like a whole ecosystem. So that's where it gets really interesting, right? When we think about cultural conflict and war as expressions of entropy, like pushing back against all that organization we've tried to create.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating to think about is that while civilization as a whole is this massive thing aiming for low entropy, it's actually built from all these smaller localized meaning systems. It's like, why do different groups of people, even if they're close geographically, have such wildly different ideas about what matters, what's right or wrong, even what things mean?
Well, if you go back to that idea of building order, it makes sense that groups would tailor their efforts to their own situation, right? Like different environments, histories, resources. It'd be kind of weird if everyone's approach to dealing with chaos was exactly the same. So, yeah, it's a very like localized approach to order building.
Exactly. Each group comes up with its own unique meaning system. This framework of shared beliefs, values, practices, all that, to reduce uncertainty and create internal order within their community. And this localization thing, it's like a fundamental feature of any low entropy construction. We see it everywhere. Like take language, for example.
Oh, yeah, for sure. We've got thousands of languages, right? Each with its own grammar, vocabulary, its own way of like putting thoughts together. And within a group that shares a language that totally reduces entropy, right? Like communication's way more efficient, collaboration's easier.
Exactly. Language is like this powerhouse for reducing entropy within a group. It makes communication clear, fosters shared understanding. But here's the flip side. When different language groups bump into each other, that same diversity becomes a source of increased entropy between them. Communicating gets harder. Misunderstandings pop up. It's like they're playing by different sets of rules.
That's such a good point. What's super obvious in one language can be total gibberish in another. It's like trying to run different software that's totally incompatible. And we see the same kind of thing with religious beliefs,
Well,
right?
absolutely. Different civilizations have come up with these mind-blowingly diverse mythological and religious systems to explain the world, where they come from, their moral codes, all that. And within each culture, these beliefs work to reduce that fear of the unknown, right, and establish a sense of moral order, their own internal meaning order.
So these shared beliefs create a sense of like cohesion and predictability within the group. But then when civilizations with totally different religious beliefs meet each other, well, that's often where things get really messy, isn't it?
Yeah, history's full of examples of religious differences, like fueling these huge conflicts between civilizations, because these belief systems are so deeply tied to a group's identity and how they see the world, right, clashes over them, can be super hard to resolve. And it's not just religion either. Think about all the regional variations in laws and morality.
Oh, yeah, totally. What's considered a huge no-no in one society might be totally fine, even expected in another. Social norms are all over the place. But then again, the whole point of laws and morals is to reduce chaos internally, right? To make social interactions more predictable, build that social order.
Exactly. Different legal systems and social norms are designed to create order within their specific cultural context. But these differences can lead to some serious cultural and value clashes when societies interact. What one culture sees as totally just and fair could seem completely chaotic and unjust to another.
So this whole localization of culture thing, this crazy diversity of meaning systems, it often leads to these huge misunderstandings. What one culture has carefully built up as order can look like total chaos to another just because their underlying frameworks of meaning are like speaking different languages. It makes conflict between groups seem almost inevitable in a lot of cases.
Yeah, it really highlights how hard it is to create this large-scale unified order when the very foundation of that order, those cultural meanings are so diverse and specific to their local context. And this brings us to maybe the most extreme example of this tension war.
War, it feels like the ultimate example of entropy increase, right? Destruction, chaos, lives shattered. It's hard to see any kind of order in that.
On the surface, yeah, war is this massive and devastating increase in entropy. But if we dig a little deeper, we often find that war also involves intentions of entropy decrease, at least from the perspective of the people or groups who are fighting. It's this stark example of that push and pull between the drive for order and that pull towards disorder.
Okay, so how can something as inherently chaotic as war also have these intentions of entropy decrease? That seems kind of counterintuitive.
Well, think about it this way. War is often started by a low entropy system, a nation-state and empire, a civilization that sees a chance or feels the need to spread its own version of order over a wider area or more people. A lot of aggressive wars are driven by a system that thinks its own organization, its meaning system, is better or more ordered, and wants to control or absorb a system it sees as disordered, weaker, or just plain different. Their goal is to create this bigger, more unified order with him in charge.
So it's like one relatively organized system trying to impose its organization on what it sees as a less organized one, hoping to create this bigger, more coherent whole, at least from their point of view.
Exactly. This can even show up as the suppression and, tragically, even the extinction or forced assimilation of weaker cultures by the dominant ones during or after a conflict. Now, this is obviously brutal and ethically horrific, but it can be seen as a kind of entropy decrease from the aggressor's perspective. By wiping out cultural diversity, they're trying to make a more homogeneous system of meaning, which they think will make governing easier and reduce cultural and ideological entropy within their expanded territory.
That's a chilling thought, destroying a culture in the name of creating a more unified order. But history's definitely full of examples of this happening. You also said, though, that war often leads to a net increase in entropy in the long run. How does that work?
Sadly, history shows us again and again that even when a culture or empire wins a war and expands its territory, the long-term consequences often end up creating more entropy overall. Managing a bigger, more diverse population adds complexity, administrative burdens, internal dissent, and centrifugal forces that can pull the empire apart and maybe even lead to its collapse. Plus, the pure devastation of war, the loss of life, destroyed infrastructure, disrupted social order, collapsed economies, destroyed cultural heritage, it all pushes the whole system towards greater disorder.
So even if the original intention was to establish more orders, the act of war itself and all the stuff that comes after often backfires and leads to even more chaos and instability in the long term.
Exactly. War in this sense is kind of like a low entropy system, trying to find a localized and often super violent solution, a desperate self-rescue, under the immense and never-ending pressure of the universe's entropy increase. But this approach is incredibly destructive and often fails to actually fight against that fundamental trend. It's like trying to fix a complicated machine by smashing it with a hammer. You might change something temporarily in a small area, but you're probably going to cause a lot more damage in the process.
So, war, with all its brutality, really highlights this constant back and forth between humanity's desire for order and the universe's drive towards disorder, with entropy often winning out in the end. Now let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture, the whole evolution of civilization. It's this long, messy, and often chaotic process full of change, upheaval, conflict, and revolution. Are all these changes just unavoidable signs of entropy increasing, or is it more like civilization as this complex low entropy system is actively trying to adapt and survive in the face of all this pressure?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? When we look at the whole story of civilization with all its transformations and upheavals, are we mainly seeing this inevitable decline towards greater disorder? Or are we witnessing this constant adaptation, this struggle to maintain some semblance of order in a universe that's inherently entropic?
Let's start with the idea that civilizational evolution is mainly a result of entropy increase. What evidence do we have for that?
Well, if we look at the big transitions and shifts in civilization, we do see trends that fit with the idea of increasing entropy. The fall of empires, the rise of new social structures, these periods are often marked by instability, uncertainty, and the breakdown of established norms. Take technological development, for example. The information explosion we've seen throughout history, from writing to the printing press to the internet, has without doubt led to a massive increase in the amount of information out there.
Totally. The amount of information flying around today is exponentially bigger than it was even a few hundred years ago. It spreads faster, it's easier to access, but there's definitely a downside to that, right? Information overload, fragmentation of knowledge, misinformation. It can feel like we're drowning in data, but not necessarily getting smarter or more informed as a society.
Exactly. While this explosion of information has brought huge benefits in terms of spreading knowledge and driving innovation, it's also contributed to information overload, fragmentation of expertise, and the rise of things like fake news and echo chambers. You could say this represents an increase in societal information entropy, a decrease in the clarity, reliability, and shared understanding of the information landscape.
That's a really interesting way to look at it. What about the fact that our social structures are getting more and more complex? Civilizations have definitely become way more intricate over time.
Absolutely. We've gone from relatively simple tribal organizations to super complex nation states and these increasingly interconnected global networks. This has led to more specialization of labor, more intricate systems of governance and organization, and a wider range of social interactions. And while this complexity can make things more efficient and adaptable, in some ways it also introduces more fragility and instability. Managing these crazy complex systems becomes a huge challenge, and the potential for things to break down and have unforeseen consequences goes way up. You could say this leads to higher social system entropy.
It's like the more moving parts you have in a machine, the more chances there are for something to go wrong. What about our beliefs and ideologies? It seems like modern societies are way more diverse and fragmented in that respect, too.
Definitely. In more traditional societies, you often find pretty unified belief systems, whether religious or cultural. But modern societies tend to have a much wider range of ideologies, with individuals often following more personalized and fragmented sets of beliefs. And while this can foster intellectual freedom and innovation, it also leads to more value conflicts and makes it way harder to reach broad social consensus. This could be seen as increasing the social system's entropy, the difficulty in maintaining social cohesion, and a shared sense of purpose.
So from this perspective, the evolution of civilization does seem to show trends towards greater complexity, fragmentation, and unpredictability. This fits with the idea of the universe constantly pushing back against our attempts to create stable, low-entropy environments. It's like the universe is always trying to mess up our carefully laid plans.
Exactly. The universe seems to keep disrupting the order we try to create, pushing civilization towards higher entropy states. But like you said, there's another way to interpret these changes. Can we see the evolution of civilization not just as decay, but also as a form of adaptation, a struggle for survival?
That's the more optimistic view, right? Civilizations aren't just passively fall apart, they're actively trying to find ways to survive and maintain some level of order in the face of all these entropic pressures.
Exactly. We can see civilizational evolution as this ongoing process of self-adaptation by these low entropy systems in response to the constant increase in entropy. Civilization is always adjusting and innovating to respond to external changes like environmental shifts, resource depletion interactions with other civilizations, and internal entropy-driven challenges. It's all about maintaining local order and making sure it survives in the long run.
And we see this adaptation in our institutions, right? The way we govern ourselves, the laws we create and enforce these things aren't static. They change and evolve over time.
Absolutely. Throughout history, we've seen this constant refinement of social institutions trying to deal with the governance challenges that come with increasing social complexity. Think about the shift from informal customary law to more formalized and codified legal systems, or the often messy evolution from more autocratic forms of rule towards more democratic models. These increasingly detailed and complex legal and governance systems are basically attempts to maintain order and reduce internal friction in these increasingly complex and volatile societal environments.
And then there's technology. We're always inventing new tools and techniques. Could that also be seen as a form of adaptation in response to entropy?
Absolutely. Humanity's constant pursuit of technological advancement can be seen as a direct response to a lot of challenges that are themselves a result of increasing entropy, things like resource depletion, environmental degradation, information overload, and disease. The development of more efficient energy sources, cleaner and more sustainable technologies, advanced information processing and communication tools. These are all coping strategies, ways to find creative solutions when we're facing the consequences of entropy increase.
It's like we're constantly trying to engineer our way out of the problems that complexity and disorder inevitably create. And what about our beliefs and value systems? You said earlier that they can become more diverse, which could increase entropy, but could they also be a form of adaptation?
Yes, definitely. When traditional belief systems stop working, or when societal values go through big shifts, we often see the creation of new ideologies and value systems. These fill the meaning vacuums that pop up and try to rebuild social consensus around new principles. Think about the rise of scientific rationalism during the Enlightenment, or the emergence of environmentalism in response to growing ecological concerns. These are ways that societies try to adjust their shared understanding of the world and their place in it to reshape social meaning order in the face of significant change.
So it sounds like the evolution of civilization isn't just a downward spiral into disorder. It's this constant interaction, this back and forth between the fundamental forces of entropy increase and the efforts of these low entropy systems to adapt, innovate, and maintain some level of localized order.
Exactly. Civilization doesn't just crumble under the weight of entropy, and it doesn't necessarily move in a straight line towards some perfect idea. It adapts to an inherently entropic environment by constantly reorganizing locally and making dynamic adjustments to keep some degree of low entropy order.
This is really tying everything together. If we think about all the stuff we've discussed, the cultural conflicts, the wars, the constant evolution, what's the big takeaway about the fundamental nature of civilization and its relationship to entropy?
If we put all these pieces together, we get a deeper understanding. The essence of civilization probably isn't just a simple story of increasing disorder or a steady march towards perfect order. Instead, it seems to be more like what we could call controlled entropy increase, or maybe more accurately, a constant and dynamic equilibrium between the forces of entropy increase and entropy decrease.
A dynamic equilibrium. That's a really interesting way to describe it. Can you expand on what you mean by that?
Sure, think of it this way. All our human efforts could create and maintain low entropy, order, our complex societies, our advanced technologies, our intricate belief systems. They're constantly being challenged and disrupted by the universe's basic and relentless tendency towards increasing entropy. Cultural conflicts that come from different meaning systems, the destructive power of wars, the upheaval of revolutions, the disruptive impact of technological advancements, the challenges of environmental crises, all these things could be seen as expressions of this fundamental cosmic counteraction.
So the universe is always, in a sense, pushing back against the order we're trying to create.
Exactly. But civilization isn't just sitting there taking it. It's constantly trying to adjust and innovate in response to these pressures, working to create new forms of order and maintain some level of stability in specific areas. This is where the important roles of institutional evolution, technological progress, social adaptation, and the constant reshaping of ideologies come in. These are our active entropy decrease efforts. But the key thing to remember is that each of these attempts to create more order often leads to even more complex systems, which in turn set the stage for future and maybe even bigger entropy increase challenges down the road.
It's like every time we solve one set of problems, we accidentally create a new and often more complicated set of challenges that we then have to deal with.
Exactly. So the evolution of civilization isn't a straight path of progress or a simple slide into decline. It's more like a pattern of fluctuating advancement, a constant and often intense tug of war between these two fundamental forces. Civilization basically moves forward in a spiral, constantly running into new challenges, coming up with new solutions, and navigating between periods of relative instability and shaky balance.
That perspective definitely challenges those simple linear views of history, the optimistic idea that we're always just making steady progress. But it's also more nuanced than the purely pessimistic view that everything's inevitably going to collapse.
Exactly. It gives us a different and maybe more realistic framework, civilization, as this never-ending and dynamic effort towards local entropy decrease, where every apparent victory in establishing order ends up creating new and often more complex entropy increase challenges, starting the next cycle of adaptation and innovation. It seems like the very life and resilience of civilization comes from this constant struggle to find a dynamic equilibrium between the opposing forces of order and disorder.
This has been a really insightful deep dive. It gives us a whole new way of understanding why human history often seems so chaotic.
I agree. Thanks for joining us for this exploration. We hope this discussion has given you a better understanding of the fundamental forces that shape how civilization develops and where humanity fits in the grand scheme of the universe.
The main takeaway from today, as we've been talking about, is that civilization isn't some static achievement of order. It's this constantly changing dynamic equilibrium between the forces of entropy increase and entropy decrease. And our own individual and collective search for meaning is also going to be this ongoing process of constant adjustment and adaptation within this huge cosmic dance.
And while the universe might ultimately be headed towards increasing entropy and our efforts as civilizations to fight against that might eventually hit a wall, it's this ongoing struggle, this very human effort to create and maintain order in the face of inherent disorder that makes up the most compelling and enduring story of human civilization.
That's a really powerful and thought-provoking idea to end on in this eternal back and forth between the forces of entropy increase and decrease. Can we all keep questioning what meaning really is and live out the amazing and ongoing stories of ourselves and our civilization? Until next time.